Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Manual testing is a must, but automation is divine. My name is Keaton Nguyen and I'll be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers is Ed Skoudis, SANS faculty fellow. If at any time during the webcast you have any questions for Ed or John, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We'll be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand the presentation off to Ed Skoudis.
Thank you, Keith. I really do appreciate that. I'd like to welcome everyone here. Keith already gave me a kind introduction, but the real focus of this presentation is going to be John Strand. He's got some really wonderful things to share with you today. Very thought-provoking, very interesting. I should point out, though, at the beginning here that this SANS webcast is sponsored by the SANS Hackfest. SANS Hackfest is an event we have coming up that'll run November 16th through 23rd. Super exciting stuff. It consists of a 2-day summit where we're going to have some incredible speakers. We're going to have some folks that, really are leaders in the industry sharing with you their best pen test and offensive ideas, really kind of trailblazers in how this stuff is evolving. We're going to have 2 days of that. We're then going to have a bunch of amazing classes with folks like Larry Pesci, who I understand is on this webcast, Kevin Fiskus. I'll be there. John Strand's going to be there for the summit piece. It's going to be really cool. So we do this Hackfest thing once a year. A couple of interesting extra points on the Hackfest. We do 3 nights of Net Wars. At a normal Big SANS event, we do 2 nights of Net Wars. We do 3 nights at this one to give you extra time to work your way through all the fun challenges that Net Wars is. We also do something we call Coinapalooza. In Coinapalooza, you get a chance to win SANS Pentest coins. You know, if you take a SANS Pentest class and you win the Capture the Flag, you get this coin, and the coin's really cool. It congratulates you on your victory, and it also has a cipher on the coin. What you could do in Coinapalooza is, based on your performance in Net Wars, you can win coins for SANS Pentest classes that you've already taken. So if you took the 504 class, a bunch of years ago, maybe before we had the coins, or maybe you took it and you didn't win the CTF, now you get a chance to earn your 504 coin, or your 560 coin, or your 573 coin, or what have you. It's fun stuff. You can win up to 5 coins. We're also doing 1 night of Cyber City. We do Cyber City a lot for the military. Cyber City is actually a physical city. It's a cyber range. It's 6 feet by 8 feet. So it's a miniature city, but it has real industrial control systems that control the electricity of Cyber City. So there's like a power grid in it. We got water systems, traffic systems, and you will, if you attend this event, this Hackfest event, you'll be able to work through missions in Cyber City stopping terrorists from causing mayhem. So we throw out pretty much everything we have into this. You got 2 days of your summit, you got training, you got 3 nights of Net Wars, 1 night of Cyber City, pen test coins that you can win in Coinapalooza, and honestly, to sweeten the deal, my wife also bakes cookies. Last year for Hackfest, she brought 255 cookies. We wolfed them down very quickly. In fact, Lee Neely, who's on this webcast attending, I think he had 3 or 4 of them himself. So anyway, I hope you'll be able to join us for that. But I want to get on with the presentation. So that's our sponsor, SANS Hackfest. Now, John Strand has had an interesting week. He'll tell you more about the details of his week, but he sent me his initial cut at the slide deck for this webcast on Wednesday night, very late. I read it about 1:30 a.m. And when I read it, I was like, whoa, that is amazing, mind-blowing, and weird. I thought that because it was just 1:30 a.m., maybe in the morning it'll look a little more normal to me. So Thursday morning I get up and I look through his slides again, and whoa! And it reminded me of this video I want to play for you very quickly. Maybe you've seen this movie, Back to the Future. It's from the 80s. And there's this one scene in this movie that really illustrates how I felt about the slide deck you're about to see from Mr. John Strand. Here we go. That's John delivering this presentation to you. That might be you. And then, of course, John will probably, that's me right there. If you see me, yeah.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But the kids are going to love it.
And I felt like Marty McFly's mom after reading John's slides.
Marty, that was very interesting music.
Marty, that was very interesting. John, these are very interesting slides. So why don't we go ahead and with that, turn it over to John Strand. Keith, if you could hand John the presentation, I'd appreciate it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Ed.
So take it away, Mr. Strand. Take it away.
Let's get started. All right, as Ed mentioned, I've had a very, very, very interesting week. It started out on Monday, and I basically ended up in the hospital Monday afternoon. I had a heart arrhythmia, and they hooked me up to a whole bunch of different things, and immediately freaked out. So they're running around, and they're like, oh my God, his heart is all over the place. It's not beating steady. And they used a whole bunch of other technical terms which make absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. And I was kind of freaking out. So I decided to take this selfie and send it to all the people at BHIS. And I said, at hospital, not happy. And then finally a doctor came in and looked at it and said, oh, well, this is not as bad as we thought. It's just every other heartbeat is early. Once again, I have no idea if that's a good thing or a bad thing at this point. But they explained it was due to stress and all kinds of things, which I have no idea will be stressing me out whatsoever. But it was very, very interesting to spend the afternoon in the hospital. Now, the reason why that plays into this is because I've been on some drugs for the past couple of days, just a handful of different drugs. And that's probably what drove this presentation to be a bit strange. You take the drugs, you couple it with the 90s movies, and all of a sudden you come up with the insanity that is this webcast. I've got a challenge for all of you. The challenge is this. I want you to name all the movies and release dates in this presentation. So I'm going to have various pictures from 90s movies, and you're going to go through and you're going to create a list. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you my email address. And if you've gone through and you've got all of them, the first person to shoot me an email that correctly gets all of the movies and the release dates, I'll actually send them something nice. I'll respond back and ask for an address. I have no idea what that nice thing is whatsoever, but it'll be something nice. It'll be a nice prize to make sure that people are getting engaged and having a good time because we all survived the 90s. It'll be very, very important for us to use this as kind of a mnemonic device to run through this presentation. So why did I choose 90s movies? Because we do need something. Anytime there's a presentation like this, you want to be able to tie things in people's heads in such a way that they can think of it and very quickly recall the information that we discussed in the presentation. We call this a mnemonic device. Some of these may be from the 80s. I think I purged most of those. But I didn't do a whole lot of research. As I said, I've been a bit out of sorts and a little bit drugged for the past few days. Every morning I get a phone call from Ed Skoudis, and it's like this, hey, John, how are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm doing good. We got a whole bunch of people registered for the webcast. Do you think that you can do this webcast on Friday? And I'll respond with something like, and it'll go, good, and then I'll hang up. I'm done with that today, and I could respond more or less lucidly about today's presentation. And all of a sudden, we felt really, really, really great about the webcast moving forward, especially this topic that we're dealing with today. Because this particular topic, whenever we're talking about doing automation for information security testing, penetration testing, security automation for security assessments, whatever it is that you're doing, can become very, very difficult when we're trying to do that at scale. When you're talking tens of thousands up to hundreds of thousands of systems, it becomes exceedingly difficult to try to handle networks of that size. Whether or not you're a pen tester, whether or not you're a local security representative with your organization, many times people just kind of fold underneath the pressure and they crack. So Recon, we're going to break this up in the way that we do 560. In 560, we break out all the different sections and all the different phases that a good penetration tester is going to do. And the best penetration testers in the world actually do solid, amazing recon before they even try to send a single packet at a target organization. Now, unfortunately, for most penetration testers, I see recon as being the weakest component of their penetration tests. They will spend 10% on recon, and then they'll spend something like 40% on scanning, and then they'll try to put another 40% into doing the actual exploitation, and then the remainder, they're just going to try to get that report out the door as quickly as possible. and they don't put much time and effort at all into Recon. And lately, looking at other people's work, one of the things that Ed and I get an opportunity of doing many times is seeing other penetration testing companies work and what they do with our customers. Recon is extremely light. Almost all organizations fire off Nessus or Nexpose. They run it against the external environment. They look for the reds and they try to exploit those reds. And they miss some incredibly important components of how an organization can be successfully exploited. For example, if we take a look at the Sony attack, any good pen test or red team activity should be trying to mimic what we see in the real world. If you look at the Sony breach, they actually had credentials for administrators baked into their malware. Now, it could have been they got access to those credentials through a spear phishing campaign, a very highly targeted spear phishing campaign, or they may have gotten access to those credentials from a third-party breach. Who knows? But those third-party breaches are very important because bad guys can get access to that data, and then they can easily gain access to a network, or they can build a convincing ruse for trying to successfully exploit somebody as part of a spear phishing campaign. So Recon is something that has to be done, and it has to be done successfully. It also many times can be the most tedious aspect of what we do in penetration testing. And this goes back once again to the core definition of what hacking actually is, or what we think good penetration testing is. Whenever you're pen testing an environment, you shouldn't be looking at that environment trying to find a way in. That mindset is incorrect, and it won't serve you very well. If you're constantly looking for a way to break into an organization successfully, odds are you're not going to find it. However, if you look at an organization and you're curious about how that organization works, how all the different components of that organization work together, you're trying to learn as much as you can about the technology and the people and maybe even the culture of the organization, then you're going to have fantastic success in your penetration test. And that all begins with solid Recon. It would be impossible for us to get through a presentation on pen testing automation or security testing automation if we didn't talk about Recon NG. Of course, this fantastic tool is sponsored by BHIS and is created by Tim Tom, also known as Landmaster53 on Twitter. Just a fantastic framework. And Ed, if I'm not mistaken, isn't Recon NG finally going to graduate to being in 560 sometime here?
Oh, absolutely. We've, we talked about it. We've covered it for a while, but now we do some hands-on lab work with it, look at its data structures, interact with it, use it for some really cool things like DNS cache snooping, and so that you're trying to pull DNS cached entries associated with the target's potential antivirus company, right? If they're doing antivirus updates and it's resolving the name, we might be able to figure out which antivirus tool they're using so we could try to evade it. So yeah, we do have Recon NG in there with some hands-on stuff. Very excited about that. New addition.
Very cool. But once again, kind of going back to one of the problems, and I think we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago in Vegas, when we see most people using Recon NG, they run it one module at a time. And you can see on the screenshot, the version that I took a screenshot of, we have 75 Recon modules in Recon NG. And if you're trying to run each one of those individually, well, that's just maddening. It's going to take forever. Now, Recon NG does a lot of cool things where it records all of the information that it collects into a database. So you can run things one at a time. You don't have to copy and paste. It'll actually store it down in a nice little database, all of the hosts, all the users it identifies, all the different leak credentials that it identifies. It'll store all of that for you, but trying to do it by hand, especially against a large organization, can be extremely time-consuming. I've seen some Recon NG modules run for hours whenever they're trying to enumerate all of the different attack surfaces from using Google or Bing or Baidu, trying to find all of the different hosts can just take forever for it to finally complete trying to find all of the hosts that are accessible via those search engines. So here's something to help that. With Recon NG, you can run something called resource scripts. And what a resource script does is it automatically runs all of the modules for you that you want to run inside of Recon NG. It'll also establish some of the parameters, like, for example, a domain. So if you're attacking a domain, let's just say something like counteract.com, right? You can put in that domain as an input into the script by jhaddix, and it'll automatically load that into Recon NG, and then you can run all of the different modules within Recon NG that you want. For example, you can see right here at the top, it says workspaces select. It's going to establish that domain as a workspace. And that workspace is incredibly important to Recon NG because it allows you to identify and separate out your Recon activities. Now, one of the things I'll recommend to all of you that are planning on using this If you're doing lots of assessments against multiple different organizations, I strongly encourage that you stand up a fresh instance of Recon NG for each assessment. You can establish workspaces and keep them separate in that regard. But I have noticed from time to time, if you're working at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're running Recon NG, I've seen situations where testers basically mix domains or target organizations. Like they forget to actually set their workspace to a new target organization. And then you've got all kinds of data that's muddled in the database, and you got to go through and clean that out, and it's just a nightmare. So what I'd recommend doing, and one of the things we're doing at VHIS, is whenever you do recon, we're actually standing up new servers on the edge of our network for each test. We basically develop a solid baseline image, then you log into that image, run your activities for a specific engagement, and once you're done, blow it away. You know, just keep on updating the baseline image, but you spool up new instances for each one of your assessments. And that helps, because if you do make a mistake and you don't actually set the right workspace, it's not that big of a deal, because your engagement that you're working on is still the only one that's associated with a specific workspace that you're working through. And then right here, you can see that we're going through and trying to identify hosts through a number of different ways. You can see that we're trying to identify hosts by using Google Dork type extensions for Baidu, for Google, for Bing. You can also pull host information from Netcraft and Yahoo as well. So it allows you to go through and automate this process of trying to identify as many hosts as possible. Then, if you go down here, it has some DNS scripts that'll allow you to do bulk resolution for the hosts that you've identified to find their IP address. It'll also allow you to brute force hosts via DNS. Now that module, let me underline that one. That module is one of my favorites because it allows you to establish a dictionary list, and then it'll put all of the words in that dictionary list before the domain that you're trying to break into. So you can try to find, you know, things like testers or dev, dev1, dev2, or staging. There's a whole bunch of different, like, you know, dev ops like servers that usually don't have as much protections on them as a full production instance. We've seen a number of organizations for their production servers, they'll have web application firewalls and line intrusion prevention, SSL interception, but then they'll have a staging instance. It's on a completely different IP address, and it won't have any of those protections. It'll basically be just a dry run instance where they can test before they stage it and they load it out into production. So it's a great way to try to find places where their shields are down. And this whole entire thing got started. Christian Riley, a very good friend of Ed and I's, who does amazing work. He's just fantastic. He spent a lot of time looking at how websites behave differently if you come into a mobile part of that website versus the main production version of that website. And he initially found a lot of those exact same themes. If you try to attack a mobile version of a website, many times there aren't as many there aren't as many protections in place as what you would expect. And that's ultimately kind of getting to the gist of what we're talking about here whenever we're discussing recon at a much larger level. Whenever you're doing recon, and even in the scanning part, you're trying to find as many hosts as possible. And whenever I'm attacking an environment, there's two things I'm always looking for. Number one, I want to expand the total number of hosts available to me to attack. And that's important because if we look at something like Microsoft Patch Tuesday, if you push out patches, what overall is the percentage of those patches that are successfully deployed? In many organizations, it tops out between 80 to 85%. So if you're looking at critical patches, 80 to 85% is the absolute best case scenario for many organizations to push patches from Microsoft. Now, that is a best case scenario. If you start looking at external infrastructures and you start looking at Linux servers, you start looking at organizations that still have Solaris servers, or they're using some type of weird BSD variant, many times those systems are not as patched as the rest of the environment. And that brings me to the second thing that I'm looking for. I'm looking for texture. I'm looking to find as many hosts as I possibly can, number one, because once we get up to about 1,000 to 2,000 hosts, it becomes a very high probability that at least one of those systems has a vulnerability that has not been adequately addressed. And the second thing I'm looking for is texture. I'm looking for differences. And this is exceedingly important when we're discussing recon and we're discussing scanning, because you're going to have thousands of hosts. Many of those hosts will be set up in the exact same configuration. You're going to be looking for hosts that are different. You're going to be looking for that one rogue Linux system. You're going to be looking for that one rogue BSD system. Or flip it around, you're going to be looking for that one rogue Windows computer system on the outside of an environment. The more texture, the more variations in technologies that an organization deploys, the higher the likelihood is that we're going to find a vulnerability that's going to get us access to a network. Now, this kind of flies in the face of Schneier and Geer's paper where they were talking about monocultures, how if we all are using the exact same technology, it makes us weaker as a species. And I would agree with that in a kind of an overall internet perspective. When we're looking at networks, when we're looking at target organizations, whenever they have spread technologies and they have a whole bunch of different technologies that play on the outside of the environment, it's very unlikely that they have deep skills in every single one of those technologies, and increases the likelihood of us being successful in breaking in. So two things you're looking for in Recon. Number one, trying to expand the total number of IP addresses that are available for you to attack. And thing two, you're looking for discrepancies. You're looking for how these servers are architectured differently. You're looking for weird operating systems and weird web technologies.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Hey, John. I'm very happy to see the resource file support within Recon NG. I think that's wonderful news. Also, have you noticed how a lot of these tools that are written outside of the Metasploit framework, like Recon NG, and you're going to talk a little bit later about Empire and the Veil framework and such, they're fantastic tools. Love them. They're really good. But they're borrowing some of the ideas that Metasploit first put into place, and I think that's really good. You've noticed that kind of evolution, I'm sure, right?
Absolutely. And I think it even goes further back, Ed. I think if we look at Whisker, right, and Rainforest Puppy, I might be wrong. You have a lot more experience in that particular set of generational hackers that came out. But wasn't Whisker one of the first fully fledged frameworks that came out that allowed us all to come and play within that framework?
It was, really. Nice framework. You can add your own pieces and modules to it. But with what HD Moore and Egypt and the folks at Metasploit have done is they've pulled in so many different ideas and things like resource files and things like payloads and arsenals of different kinds of modules and so forth. While Rainforest Puppy really did kind of push the envelope on that, its full flower, I think, came with Metasploit. And there's just so many things. I'll look at something that they added to this. It's like, wow, brilliant. You did such a great job at borrowing that idea. I'm not saying copying. I'm glad they're doing this. This is not in any way an indictment. But it's great to see these ideas propagate into the other tools. And I think you see a little bit of that with Empire as you continue your presentation.
Absolutely. And I think that, the most important thing for us is with most of these frameworks, once we get in, it becomes easy, right? Because they're stealing, I don't want to say stealing, they're sharing so much with the Metasploit framework that you can get into Recon NG and you can do show modules, and it'll show all of your modules. If you know how to navigate around one framework, it makes it very, very easy to navigate across the others. And that's one of the reasons why, and I don't want to go down a tangent, people talk about Armitage, and Armitage is fantastic. I have no problems with Armitage, but you have to know what's going on underneath the hood. So if you're using MSF Console, you'll develop a better understanding, not only the Metasploit framework, but also these other frameworks that we're going to discuss and how they're actually put together. Whereas if you're just using a GUI, many times you're going to lose that connectivity with the actual framework itself. And I just think it's fantastic all the way across.
Amen, brother.
All right. Network ranges. So this is something that came up for me in kind of a black box pen test that we're working on. We're currently working on a very, very, very large organization, and one of the things that they wanted us to do was to see if we could properly identify all of the network ranges that are associated with their target organization. And they fully expected that we wouldn't get everything right, and I wouldn't expect to get everything right out of the gate. Now, we weren't attacking anything at this point. We weren't. We were just simply trying to enumerate the total attackable surface, or the surface that an attacker would actually go after. And I really wanted to grab, for each one of the IP addresses, I wanted to grab the ASN numbers and the BGP network ranges associated with each of those IP addresses. Now, for those of you that don't know, whenever you're using ASN and you're using BGP, this is the way routers identify their area of responsibility. So a network router on the edge of your network will say, I'm responsible for the IP address range 8.8.8.0 through 255. And it'll say, I'm responsible for anything within this network range, or it'll probably be like 0/24. It'll actually give its classless interdomain routing nomenclature of what it's responsible for. And all of the other routers around the world will then forward their route request information whenever somebody's trying to connect to that network to the proper router because of what they're actually doing as part of the peering process. Now, This wasn't in Recon NG, and it's not there yet, but I think we'll get it added in. But if you're trying to do a very large penetration test, you'll have organizations that have multiple internet POPs or points of presence. They'll have multiple different IP addresses all around the world. And you may easily be able to easily identify each one of those IP addresses by doing some Google searches or Bing searches or Baidu searches or Yahoo searches. But that's not the only IP address that is associated with that network range. So what you can do is you can do whois, and I always pronounce this Crimu, or Cramu.
Simru.
Simru, thank
you.
you.
It's actually pronounced Cymru, but most people say Simru. But I talked to the guys who are behind the project, and it's in the original, I guess it's Gaelic, it's Cymru.
That's how they said it back then?
That's how they said it. It's pronounced Cymru. But everybody says Simru.
We'll do Simru. So you can use whois, and you can point it at their whois server, and you can give it an IP address, and it'll give you all kinds of beautiful information about that IP address. It'll give you the ASN. It'll also give you the network block associated with its BGP entry, and I'll show that here in a second. So what I do is I take all of the IP addresses that we have harvested, where we've gone through and done Google searches. We've identified all of these different hosts, and then we take the IP addresses out of Recon NG, and then I just paste it into a file called input.txt. Then for each line in the input.txt, it's going to go through and identify, oops, I got something that's not commented out in that second line. I'll fix that real quick. It'll go through each one of them, and for each one of the IP addresses, it'll pull out all of that information that is so useful to me to find additional network ranges. So I put in some network ranges of some IP addresses that are near and dear to my heart. So I have CounterHack is in here, Black Hills Information Security is in here, Security Weekly is in here, and SANS.org is in here. And I was able to identify the IP address that I put in. Its AS number, you can see AS numbers here on the far left-hand side. You've got 36351, 23148. These are the AS numbers associated with their edge routers. You have the IP address, and then that IP address lands inside of a BGP prefix range. So you can see that the IP 45.33.6.10 lines up with 45.33.0.0/19. 204.51.94.79 is part of the BGP prefix of 204.51.92.0. Now, does this necessarily mean that all of those hosts in that specific range are associated with the target organization? Not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that. In very large networks, we found predominantly it does, because a lot of those networks, they have their own edge routers, they're handling their own BGP infrastructure, they're managing everything. And that'll at least get you in the network neighborhood of where additional hosts will be that you can then attack. So that's awesome for greatly trying to expand the total attack surface, because this will come into more importance a little bit later once you start doing scanning of a target organization. So another great tool that we just absolutely love, we wrote Peeping Tom, I think it would have been 3-4 years ago now, and we created Peeping Tom because if you're doing a large-scale penetration test and you have an infrastructure that you're attacking that has, let's just say, 5,000 web servers, and that happens quite regularly in a number of different pen tests, how do you actually effectively attack those web servers? Now, the wrong answer would be to just run Nessus against them. Or another wrong answer would be, let's fire up W3AF or burp and just scan every single one of them. And the reason why I say that that's the wrong answer is because there are many times that you successfully break into a web server, not because of an inherent vulnerability within that web server, but rather because of something that's blatantly obvious that an automated tool will miss. I'll give you an example. Years ago, right before we actually switched over, we had NetWars, we would do these hack at nights and these hackathons, and it was a lot of fun. There was no structure to it. It wasn't nearly as polished as NetWars is today, but it was basically everyone would bring a vulnerable server, everyone would bring some beer, and we just have a great time kind of attacking each other's systems. It was chaotic and it was beautiful, and it needed to die and get replaced by something with more structure. But one of the servers that I would bring in would be a web server with no known vulnerabilities within the web server. And if you ran a scanning tool against the web server, it would come up with 0 vulnerabilities. If you ran burp, come up with no vulnerabilities. It was a very, very basic web server. And I'd walk around the classroom and I'd talk to people and say, hey, how's it going trying to attack 10.10.10.15? And they would say, oh man, I ran a whole bunch of scanning tools against it and I'm not finding anything. I'm going through Metasploit right now to see if there's any exploits available for it. I'm like, okay, well, have you surfed to the website? And they say, no, haven't. Okay. Come back a half an hour later, and the server's driving me insane. I can't break into this web server. I'm like, what have you tried? Well, I tried this Metasploit exploit. I tried this other Metasploit exploit. I tried this new 0-day that came out just yesterday. None of them are getting me in. And I would say, have you actually tried surfing and viewing that web page? No, we haven't. And finally, at the end of the night, many times this one lone web server would be the last thing standing. No one was able to break into this web server. And everybody would say, that is one very difficult web server to break into it. And they would ask, John, how do we break into the web server? And I would open up a browser, and it was nothing but a user ID and a password field. And below the user ID and the password field was these following words. The default user ID is admin. The default password for logging into this server is admin12345. All they had to do was simply open up a browser, surf to it. They read what the user ID and password is, and they walk straight in. And this is important because, unfortunately, whenever we're doing this automation, we need to look at automation as extensions of our eyes and ears. They're truly, whenever we're doing network penetration testing, they become our senses. They become our understanding of the target organization, and we can't rely on them completely. So really great security researcher Chris Trunser came up with a new tool called Eyewitness that takes all of these great ideas of Peeping Tom, and it just takes it way beyond the stratosphere. It's just beautiful. So it does screenshots of RDP, it does VNC, it does websites, automatically parses out interesting sites and services from Nmap and .nessus output. So you can basically use that .nessus output or that Nmap XML output. It'll find any of the different URLs that are in there, and it'll automatically go to that site, and it'll take a screenshot of that site, and then it'll drop it into a really nice HTML report for you. And I want to show you some of the fun things that you can find with this. So
hey,
this
John,
is kind of the oh yes, Ed.
Guess who's going to be presenting at the Hackfest coming up in November, 16th and 17th?
Is it this guy?
It's that guy, Harrison
That
Ford.
guy. We have Harrison Ford?
Yes. no, even better. It's going to be Chris Trunker. He's going to be there. It's going to be awesome. Yeah.
So that's just great.
Better than Harrison Ford. Nice.
So just fantastic. So the kind of the HTML breakdown, it'll show you uncategorized. It'll give you all the different 401, 403, uncategorized, 404 not founds. And it'll break it out into a number of different pages in injection attack. Oops, there we go. Next one is this. This was something that was found actually on a real penetration test. It says, hello world, I am, and then it gave a name. How cool was that, right? It was basically someone's first attempt at trying to develop a web server. And they basically put it out there. Now, unfortunately, this particular web server stood the tests of time. We didn't actually see a way of breaking into this particular web server, but we got really, really excited about it. And then you'll see tons and tons of things like SSL VPN services where you'll find where you can use these user accounts and passwords that you were able to pull down from a previous part of Recon, from using something like Recon NG. You can start now using those user IDs and those passwords against the target organization. So it's very, very, very helpful to be able to find those things, right? Now, an honorable mention is a tool called Roar. Love Roar. And this is why I love Roar. Remember, I was telling you we're ultimately looking for discrepancies, right? We want to look for different architectures and different web servers that are actually being used in a target organization that you're trying to break into. So here you can see that a lot of these servers are very tightly configured to using the exact same things again and again and again. These little areas where they're green, many times that tells me that that server is set up just slightly different than another site, any of the other sites that are there. And that'll allow me to focus my efforts on that specific website, on that specific web infrastructure, and then I can try to target and attack that one instead. Now, why is that important? Because like I said, it's texture, right? It's all about that texture that we can successfully identify and we can define. We're looking for that one web server that hasn't been patched in a long time. We're looking for that one SSH server that maybe is known to have default user ID and password credentials that they forgot about. Polycom devices are notorious for this. They'll have telnet service, they'll have exposed directly to the internet, and many times you have default user ID and password credentials that allow you straight access into a Polycom device. There was one, we found a telnet server, we were able to get in and we were able to change the password for the web server infrastructure of the Polycom device, and then we were able to pull down all of the video archives of all of their different board meetings a whole bunch of sensitive information was released in those meetings, we could pull all that down. So that's what's so important, is we're trying to find that texture associated with the target organization. Now comes the big one. Now comes the big baddie. Dealing with Nessus results. I would say out of all the questions that I get whenever I teach, and Ed, I don't know about you, but this, to be honest, is probably one of the most often asked questions. Yep. How do you deal with large-scale scanning results?
And they say, should I like attach, 400 pages? I'm like, oh, so you didn't get 1,000 pages that time?
Well, yeah, we actually had one customer. It's kind of funny you mentioned that. We submitted a report, and they said, well, this report is much smaller than our previous pen test report. I'm like, oh, really? It's like 105 pages long. I'm like, well, the last report was something like 500-600 pages long. They had basically taken the entirety of their scanning output tool, they converted it into a Word document and sent that to the customer. And I asked the customer, like, how long does it take to open it? Oh, we had to have a special computer with a whole bunch of extra memory to be able to effectively open that document. And I thought that was fairly hilarious, just because that's what we see a lot of penetration testing companies do. They try to make their documents, they try to make their scan results as large as possible because they somehow equate that with quality of work that's being done. So it's time to stop the insanity. Many organizations are parsing results for thousands and thousands of systems, and a common question is, how do we handle the results of 10,000 to 100,000 or maybe even 1 million systems? Well, first, you don't look at it that way. You really shouldn't look at it as a whole bunch of individual computer systems. Let's just say, hypothetically, it takes you 10 seconds to review a finding on one server. And let's say, hypothetically, there's 10 findings per server, and then you have 1 million servers, or 100,000 servers, or even 10,000 servers. It's going to take you roughly towards the heat death of the universe to actually fully and completely parse every single one of those vulnerability results in your organization. It's going to be very, very difficult to cut through that effectively because you're sorting it incorrectly. So we use this analogy when we released Rita at DerbyCon. We're trying to develop ways to look at data, and it's like a prism. You can turn it in different ways and get different views. If you're looking at your vulnerability reports as 10,000 hosts, and there's 10 vulnerabilities on average per host, that becomes a very almost impossible task of actually looking at those vulnerabilities effectively. So what we recommend is don't do that. Just don't sort by hosts. No, stop. It's a bad idea. I know that many of you will try to break it up by business unit. I understand the importance associated with doing that. When you're going through and trying to do a solid vulnerability assessment and trying to identify the core vulnerabilities with your organization, it becomes exceedingly difficult to do so effectively if you do it by hosts. Instead, what we recommend is sorting by vulnerability. While you may have 100,000 plus systems, I find it very, very rare that organizations have over 1,000 unique vulnerability IDs. So instead of sorting it by 10,000 or 100,000, sort it by the vulnerability IDs, and then it becomes something that's far more manageable because you're going to have your vulnerabilities cluster. You may have 5,000 systems with a particular vulnerability. You may have 2,000 with another vulnerability, but they share that common theme. They share that common plugin ID across the entire infrastructure of those servers. So if you try to attack that vulnerability, rather than having all of your systems administrators attack each one of those servers individually, you can come up with an organizational level approach for handling this vulnerability across the entire infrastructure. And that makes it a lot easier to identify, and it makes it a lot easier to try to rectify those vulnerabilities if you look at it in the number of plugin IDs that you have available to you. Now, this is from last May. We did a webcast, and I talked about the rolling ball of poop in information security. And what I mean by this is most organizations that I work with, they look at just the high and critical vulnerabilities in their organization. And it's like this huge snowball that rolls every single year, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're starting to see a very heavy inflection point in our penetration tests. As I said, if an organization has 1,500 to about 2,500 servers on the outside of their perimeter, we're starting to find more and more that those organizations have lows and medium-level vulnerabilities that will allow a determined attacker to get direct access to their environment. But they're ignored because many organizations take like the PCI standards and they ignore everything below a certain vulnerability score rating. And that creates just a massive security risk for everybody involved in that organization. And this continues to grow. You know, I'll oftentimes use the analogy too, whenever you first started working on computers at an enterprise level, many of us started in 2000, 2001, 2002, working with networked, you know, Windows 2000 systems or Windows NT systems. And many times the applications we had on our desktop was maybe one or two applications. That's it, core applications that we would use. And then of course you would have the Office suite. Today, many organizations' standard notebook build have hundreds of icons on their desktop. So we don't purge software from our organizations very well at all. So the amount of software that's running many times continues to grow, and it gets bigger and bigger year after year. And this also holds true for the vulnerabilities that we choose to ignore. And we're starting to see that inflection point where these vulnerabilities are being used directly to compromise many of our customers. And we're seeing many of our customers compromised effectively against tons and tons of bad actors, or bad actors are actually exploiting these low and medium vulnerabilities. And that's something that terrifies me. Because right now we have set standards that say we should do X, Y, and Z, only handle these vulnerabilities with a rating above, and these lower rating vulnerabilities are the ones that we're using to gain access to networks. So how much longer is it until the bad guys start taking advantage of that? So here's an example. Whenever I say you can quickly parse through the results, I want to explain why. So if we have Nessus output, and you can see here we have the exact same output that shows for host after host after host after host after host after host, you can see that there's very little discrepancies or variance in the way that this infrastructure is associated with their architecture. So almost all of their servers have the /CGI bin /icon /JavaScript directories that were identified by a vulnerability assessment scanner. And there were thousands of hosts that had the exact same footprint for their server builds. And that was because their administrators did a very good job of keeping things consistent, keeping things in lockstep with each other, making sure the exact same architecture, the exact same structure was being used for ease of systems operations, for ease of troubleshooting, and to make life just easier for systems and application administrators across the board. So this means I can look at one low vulnerability, like directory indexing, which I just absolutely love, and I can quickly scroll through, and I can say these generally are not that interesting to me, because as we go down, there was just one directory that had admin.back. So almost everything looked like this, but there was one directory that was /admin.back. Now, why would I be interested in the .back files? Well, those are backup files. Those were administrator directory backup files, and within that backup file was a user ID and a password that allows you to get access to that particular infrastructure. Now, if you went through each individual host, as you can see, we have thousands of hosts here on the left. If you're reviewing all the vulnerabilities for every single one of them, you would eventually get frustrated and quit and just stop doing the analysis across all of the different servers. And you would miss this, because this was listed in an informational level finding for the directories that were available. But this was the vulnerability that would allow you to get access to that particular network. So that's what we're trying to drive at. If you can have the data displayed in such a way that you can quickly and easily review it in a way that makes sense, then you're going to be very, very, very effective. So when we're doing vulnerability assessments and you have thousands and thousands and thousands of hosts that are out there, it becomes very easy for us to deal with large-scale vulnerability assessments because we're twisting the prism and we're looking at the data in a different way that makes it far easier for us as penetration testers to exploit that organization. So you guys want a free tool. I know that we promised you guys a free tool. This particular tool is called AutoScan with Burp, and Carrie from Black Hills Information Security wrote this tool, and she's released it, giving you the Bitbucket link where you guys can use it. And what it does is it automates running Burp in headless mode, and it automates running NICTO, and it also supports authentication. So predominantly, this is a tool that you would use for large web infrastructures where you want to test your web infrastructure, let's say, every month, or you want to test it every quarter. You can use this tool. You can provide it with credentials that allow you to log into these servers, and it'll automatically scan it with Burp, it'll automatically scan them with NICTO, and it'll kick out the reports for you. Unfortunately, a number of organizations that we work with, they tend to do the exact same thing every month or every quarter, where they fire up Burp or they fire up their automated tool and they run it manually. They'll log in, they'll run the scan, and they'll move to another web server, they'll log in, they'll run the scan, they'll move on to another server, log in, run the scan, and it takes a very long time for them to do this. Now, at her Bitbucket site, she actually has step-by-step instructions on how to create a cron job for it as well, so you can automate this web application scan and kick out the reports in a way that's easy for you to actually parse and work through those results. So this is usually something that we give our customers. We give them this tool to assist them with actually trying to run their own automated scans moving forward. Because I find it sad that so many organizations don't do this as part of their system build or their quality assurance process. Before they push something into production, they should always, always run, at least at a basis, something like Burp, something like Nikto, or maybe even something like Z attack proxy against their servers. So this is a great tool that automates that across the board. So let's talk a little bit about exploitation automation. I want to get Ed's opinion on this. So there's a lot of tools out there that automate the process of getting shells. Like you can be on an internal penetration test, give it a network range, and the tool will automatically find the vulnerabilities, and it'll attempt to exploit all of those different vulnerabilities, and it'll bring back all of the shells and queue them all up for you. Now my take on this is don't. Just don't. It's going to come back to haunt you. Trust me. Years and years and years ago, whenever I started doing this, whenever you get a magical tool that automatically does exploitation, it can be exceedingly tempting to try and run it against a production environment to see how many shells you can pop. And I remember one of my first customers that I had as Black Hills Information Security, they had a full staging environment, full replication of their production environment, and they were like, wow, this is cool, we want to run this. I'm like, all right, let's run it. And we ran this in the staging environment, and it ended up bricking, like not bricking, but it ended up crashing 2 systems in that staging environment. It didn't impact production at all, but it was at that point that I was just like, whoa, let's step back from this and let's not do this ever again. And I was lucky. I got my hand burnt in a staging environment. It didn't actually crash anybody's production data, and the customer was right there with me. But I learned that lesson from that point on, that this can in fact be dangerous. So Ed, I want to get your opinion on this too.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would rather go at a network with a scalpel than a machete. And oftentimes, if you got 80 shells, what are you going to do with 80 shells? I mean, you have to interact with all these different systems. I think it's better to be smarter about it, find those systems that are really important, and try to pivot to them so that you can help better understand their business risks. Also, with the increasing deployment of host-based and network-based IPS, all those shells are going to be really loud in the network and may end up getting you blocked pretty quick. So I think your better bet is to surgically go after certain hosts, or maybe you pivot through less important hosts and then get to the more important stuff. I think you're serving the target organization better that way, and as you point out, it's a lot less risky for just crashing stuff. That's why, back in the days when Metasploit had the auto-pwn feature, I would always use it for recommendations of what to try, as opposed to actually just throwing everything at everything. So I do like automation features that say, hey, this exploit might work against this target system. Then I can review and see if that's interesting for me to use. If you look at like Armitage, it's got that capability in its Hail Mary feature, for example. Yeah.
And this also gets back to, I think, unfortunately, the mindset of a lot of people in the pen test puppy mill industrial complex is they rate their tests on how many shells they got. I still have people that shoot me emails, and they're like, well, we got 50 shells, we got 100 shells, that was a great pen test. And that's kind of the wrong standard to try to base your ability to successfully compromise network based on that. And I kind of got a quote, another quote that probably comes from the 90s, at least I think it does, pretty sure it does. I'm not afraid of the man who wants 100 nukes, I'm afraid of the man who only wants 1. And that's kind of applies to shells, right? I'm not afraid of the person who's trying to get 100 shells, I'm terrified of the person who just needs 1 to successfully destroy your network. I
disagree with you there. I'm afraid of both the guy who wants 100 nukes and the guy who wants 1. Just me, that's just me, but I'm just saying.
That's probably a better choice. I agree. Probably a good point. But, and it also goes back to, Ed, something that we've spent some time talking about at DerbyCon. There needs to be a definition split between what a penetration is and a red team is. And if you're looking at red team activities and you're trying to mimic what threat actors actually do, we don't see many threat actors today that get on an environment and they load up an automation tool and start exploiting every single system on that network. We see them being very selective. We see them moving very methodically and using a lot of protocols like SMB that won't trigger a lot of alert or alarm. All right, post-exploitation. So this is absolutely something you should do. I think that automation of post-exploitation is fantastic if it's done right. Once again, we're not trying to automate trying to get shells. That's not exactly what we're after here. We're going to look for things, right? We're going to look for lots of things. We're going to automate scanning of files. We're going to look for scanning of systems, RDP sessions, admin creds, and this is going to allow us to pivot mercilessly. And that's ultimately what our goal is, right? We want to find that sensitive data as part of that penetration test. And it's kind of funny, you know, a lot of times we stop when we get domain administrators. Say, well, we got domain admin, we're done, and then we just walk away. And that's not really effective at all, I mean, to illustrate risk. Now, anybody that's in tech knows that if you got domain admin, you effectively have everything, and that's somewhat problematic, right? It's one of those disconnects between upper-level management and IT geeks, where we say we got domain admin, and a lot of the upper-level managers, they have no idea what that actually means. They don't know what a domain is. They don't know what a domain administrator is. And while you're like using your hands, you know, using jazz hands to articulate how excited you are at getting domain admin, it doesn't actually get that risk across. And as a professional penetration tester or red teamer, your goal is to demonstrate risk. And that risk is effectively demonstrated for identification of sensitive files, looking for sensitive systems. How do we identify sensitive systems? Well, if you have a system that has 4 RDP sessions on it, that might be a sensitive system. That might be a jump system as well. And that will really help you identify that core risk in the organization. So Scruffy says the last reference was from 2001, but that specific episode of Futurama was about time travel. If you guys remember, they had big problems trying to, you know, they kept on jumping ahead in time because a whole bunch of, I don't know what they called them, anti-protons or something, had been released, and they were creating time holes, and they had to enlist the help of Bubblegum Tate, or Dr. Bubblegum Tate, to try to, you know, basically fix the space-time continuum. So because it was about time travel, Scruffy says, I'll allow it, and there we go. So PowerShell Empire.
I think you're reaching. I'll accept it. I think you're reaching. Go ahead.
I might be. But remember, I'm on drugs. So PowerShell Empire. PowerShell Empire is one of those tools. Whenever it was released, it didn't really make a huge splash, as near as I could tell, until it was released at B-Sides, Las Vegas, right before Black Hat and DEF CON. And that's where people effectively lost their minds. And the goal of the developers behind PowerShell Empire was to try to tie together all of the awesome PowerShell components that were all over the place. The Veil framework had tons of all kinds of things like PowerDump and PowerView, all kinds of standalone PowerShell scripts that you could use post-exploitation. Carlos Perez, Dark Operator, had a whole bunch as well, as Obscure Sec and Metasploitation. A whole bunch of others have created all these awesome PowerShell post-exploitation tool sets. And PowerShell makes sense for a pen tester, right? It's a full language that you have accessible in every single operating system and every single pen test you use. I mean, if they're running Windows 7 or greater, they have some version of PowerShell that exists. And it makes it very easy for us to use that existing toolkit. And the reason why is a lot of AV engines, because you know, a lot of malware isn't written in PowerShell yet. A lot of security products like Bit9 will allow PowerShell to execute. So if you can get access to a standalone system, you can then use PowerShell because it's an allowed tool, because systems administrators use that tool effectively to administer their network. So it's fantastic what they released, and it's very rare. You know, Ed was talking about Metasploit being the framework. It's very rare that we see a framework that's released that's this full-fledged. I can't think of any situation, even Metasploit when it was released, wasn't as full-fledged as the PowerShell Empire. And once again, I agree with Ed. It's basically on shoulders of giants. Go ahead, Ed. Yeah.
This thing is awesome. Seriously, if you're a pen tester, if you're a defender, if you're a forensics person, you need to look at this, download it, experiment with it. It is incredibly powerful. There's so many modules that do so many different things. It's just breathtaking. Oh, hey, John. Guess who's going to be presenting at Hackfest on November 16th and 17th?
Mr. Bean. No.
We asked Mr. Bean. We're still in discussions with his agent. The team behind PowerShell Empire. They're coming, and they're going to present on it, and I'm super excited because I think it's a breathtaking tool. This is cool stuff. I'll let you get back to talk about the details.
I got a question for you, Ed. I know that Windows 10 is planning on restricting the ability for PowerShell scripts to execute. Do you think that's going to effectively curtail the effectiveness of something like PowerShell Empire, or do you think in the end game it really doesn't matter all that much?
I think it's kind of like what they said about UAC years ago. Oh my gosh, UAC is going to get in our way, and then over time people figured out ways to get around it. I think it's going to be at most a speed bump, likely not even that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think this gets into one of those major problems. Microsoft can put in all of these speed bumps. to try to stop us from being effective using PowerShell. But organizations still use PowerShell to be effective at administering their systems. And the most effective tools we have as penetration testers are those tools that reside in the gray area, right? Those tools that reside in places where administrators use them, and then we can use them as well. And it becomes exceedingly difficult to effectively block those tools. And that's just one of the reasons why PowerShell Empire is so awesome. So what exactly does it do? It allows for lateral movement in a whole bunch of ways. You can use pass the hash, invoke WMI, invoke PS exec, and then PS remoting. The PowerShell remoting is one of those things that's always been interesting, but I really couldn't see how effective it would be until the PowerShell Empire made it a lot easier to use. Persistence, you got power breach, userland, elevated. Situational awareness for both the host and the network, because a lot of times whenever you get access to a system, you don't know much about the host that you're on, and you don't know much about the network itself. Now, some people will say, well, why don't you just use Metasploit's interpreter? Metasploit's interpreter is fantastic. There's no question about that. However, you can integrate PowerShell Empire with Metasploit. You can actually use it as a payload and drop it on a system. So it's not like you're looking at these as two different tools, just more tools in your utility belt. If you can get in with Metasploit interpreter, rock on, do that, that's great. But if you start getting stuck or errors start happening or they're stopping the stagers from actually loading in the stages, then maybe you want to switch into a different tool. And if we just look at this like for example, let's use the social engineering toolkit. It took organizations, or it took a lot of AV companies, something like 6 years to actually start writing signatures for the Java applet that Dave Kennedy and his team was using in the social engineering toolkit. And they just never really got around to trying to detect it effectively. So yeah, by switching up your toolkits, a lot of times tools like this, well, we all know about in the pen testing community, a lot of AV companies, they don't consider it to be a risk or a threat because they're not seeing it being used by quote unquote bad actors, be it nation state actors or organized crime. And that's also one of the key drivers of something like the PowerShell Empire. It was designed so that we could properly map and mimic what bad actors were doing. Now granted, it's a different tool set, but a lot of the protocols and a lot of the techniques are still the same underneath the hood. Local collection from screenshots, key logging, clipboard theft, and of course you can run these things on one system, or once you've got it spread across multiple systems and environment, you can run it on all of the systems that you have access to. So kind of some conclusions for this entire thing. I believe in the next 5 years that the whole role of what a penetration tester does is going to shift. Ed has been talking about this for a while now, about definitions. What do we define as a pen test? What do we define as a vulnerability assessment? And that's good and that's bad, right? It's great because we as an industry get to define it properly if we do it correctly. It's bad because you may have somebody else that defines it for you. And we've kind of lost the term penetration test. A lot of people look at it as a penetration test as simply a vulnerability scan plus some exploitation. And a lot of penetration testers desperately want it to be more than that. So Ed believes, and I agree with him, that we need to have an expanded definition of what the range of offensive capabilities are and what group you're in. And if this is something that's interesting to you, you're probably going to need to tune into Hackfest whenever it happens, because I think Ed will be talking about it and I'll be talking about it as well. But we need to properly identify now what a penetration test involves. Because right now, like I said, most people in the penetration puppy mill industrial complex, it's just Nessus or Nexpose plus Metasploit, and that's it. You're done. You got 5 shells. Congratulations, that's a successful penetration test, and you move on to the next one. But how do we handle things at scale? How do we identify vulnerabilities out of thousands of systems effectively? How do we handle exploitation and post-exploitation and pivoting? Well, all these tools that we've covered in this presentation hopefully will help that and really, really become your eyes and ears so that you have more to analyze. You have a better texture representation of what it is you were doing against that target organization. And this means, without question, automation is key. This means that if you ever have a tester that says they never use automation, that they're lying or they're just really not that good at their job. And many of them will say, well, I get access to organizations and I don't need automation. Well, that's fine, but that may be a red team activity, right? It may be in that kind of that gray area where penetration testing is starting to morph into more of a red team type nomenclature that we need to start using more. So this is going to help us define for, because if we don't define it now, PCI is going to define it for us. If we don't define it now, you're going to see insurance companies define it for us. So let's kind of take the lead and let's set up these proper definitions about what these tools can be used for and how we can use them effectively in our penetration tests. I wanted to say thanks for attending. My email address is john@blackhillsinfosec.com. I've got Ed's email here as well. And if you were able to successfully identify all the movies in order and the year that they were released, TV shows or movies, then send me an email. And the first email that I get, by the time I receive it, not the timestamp that you put on your email, but on the time that I receive it, I will send them a nice gift. I'll respond back to the winner. Also, give me your Twitter handle so I can throw out some props and say congratulations, because I want to give credit where credit is due. And I think that we have a couple of things to close us out. If you're on Twitter, go ahead, Ed. Do you want to talk about these last few slides?
Yeah, I'll talk about these last few slides. If you want to start looking at the questions, we'll do a Q&A thing briefly as soon as I finish with these slides. And if you wouldn't mind kicking these slides forward when I ask you, that would be fantastic. Hey, guys, SANS is doing a lot interacting with the community, and we're doing a lot on Twitter and such. It'd be great if you want to follow us, just SANS Pentest. Also, we're doing some cool stuff with NetWars. We're doing a lot of collaboration, so you can come and take NetWars and participate in it at a SANS event, but you can also do it at certain select B-Sides events, which is kind of neat. We're doing it, I think it's next week or the week after at B-Sides DC. So, and we're looking at other B-Sides events where NetWars would make sense. We're also doing Cyber City. We do that at very select events. And John, if you could stop the advancement of these slides, they're moving fast. Thank you. Cyber City is that city I mentioned before. It's 6 feet by 8 feet in size, and you can come and protect the city against terrorists.
That's not me, Ed. That's not me.
Yeah, I know. Just go back and get out of PowerPoint, the present mode. So go back one slide.
I know what it is, actually. I know what it is.
It's auto advance.
I know what it is. It's the auto advance.
Yeah. It's either the auto advance or Larry Pesci. I blame Larry Pesci.
I blame Larry. There we go. All right, so we were on NetWars, and you were talking about Cyber City.
Cyber City, but what I want you to do, if you go to slide 34, that's the last one. One more down.
Oh, hold on. There we go.
So this thing here, it really is. It's a labor of love. We're putting everything we've got into it. I mentioned before, my wife's cookies. We've got the chance to earn 5 SANS Pentest coins, 3 nights of NetWars, a night of Cyber City stuff, and there's one thing I didn't mention. And, there's classes. There's some of the best speakers in the industry going to be there. You heard us mention Chris Chunker. You heard us mention the team behind PowerShell Empire. Lots of other folks. Kevin Finisterre is going to be there talking about how to use drones in your pen tests. How cool is that? I mean, this got everything we could possibly think of, including a special evening adventure, a field trip to a mysterious location. We're not telling you where we're going, but at 5 o'clock, November 17th, buses will arrive. You'll be served a nice little meal on the bus. We're going to drive to a special place, and you're going to go on a hacking adventure. And we're working really hard to pull all of that together. Our goal is to simply blow your minds with something just fun and beautiful, and to help you build your skills and interact with your peers in the industry. So this is all coming up November 16th through 17th for the 2-day element of it, and then the training November 18th through 23rd. I really would love if you guys could be there, seriously. It's at sans.org/hackfest. You can go there, you can read about all this stuff we're going to put into it, and I do hope to see you there.
So we've got some questions, Ed, and some of these are for you.
Okay,
Andrew asked, are there any new SANS Pentest courses on the horizon?
Yes. We got a new class. So first of all, we've got the 562 class, which is 6 days of Cyber City. First 5 days, you go through 15 missions battling bad guys in Cyber City. The last day, it's a 6-day class, so the last day, you're actually given a castle you have to defend, so there's blue aspects of it, and attack other castles, so there's red aspects of it. It's really neat. Our scoreboard on day 6 is integrated with the power grid of Cyber City. It's nifty stuff. So that's a new one we just rolled in the last year. It's really cool and fun and in-depth hands-on skills. We've got another one that's going to roll out early next year, and it's called Social Engineering for Pen Testers. It's a 2-day class. The course number is 567, so it's easy for you to remember. It's written by James Line and Dave Shackelford. Many of you guys know James and Dave and how brilliant they are. It's a cool class, really nifty, social engineering for pen testers. Be on the lookout for it. What else you got, John, for questions?
We got a question from Thomas. He said, during web application penetration tests, since testing each parameter for cross-site scripting and SQL injection is time-consuming, how can we what can we do in case of being too many apps? I'll take my first crack at it. If you're a professional penetration tester, you desperately need to let the customer know that there's too many apps to do for the amount of time that's been allotted. That's the only real fair thing that you can do, and you need to put it in your report. And it's honestly, I think it's the only ethical thing. Now, you might get some pushback from management. You might even get some pushback from the customer, and I understand that. But for you personally, you've got to raise it to the attention of someone above yourself that you're a bit overloaded, there's too much going on, and you don't have the adequate amount of time to do it properly. You may get overruled, but you have to document it someplace. And Ed, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. I think automation helps there as well. There's some great features within the Burp suite, as well as great features within the Z-Attack proxy, that's the ZAP proxy, for automating discovery of cross-site scripting and SQL injection and things like that. Use those, but be careful. Automation, as John pointed out very carefully in this presentation, could hurt you. That's why I like to run those automated tools, if possible, against a dev part of their environment. So I asked the customer, can you stand up a dev app for me so I'm not going against your production app? I saw a presentation years ago by one of the vendors who makes one of these automated web application scanning solutions, and he says, look, when you point my tool, and my tool is great, this vendor said, when you point that at a web application in production, it is the equivalent of handing a keyboard and mouse to a 3-year-old and saying, click on everything. Oh, and in his copy and paste buffer, he's got cross-site scripting and SQL injection attacks, and he's going to paste that everywhere. So you can see why I would like to do that in a dev environment if possible. So I'm for automation, but I do like to ask if I can get a dev environment for their web apps. The nice thing is they often have a dev environment for the apps themselves. They don't have all the fancy web application firewalls and stuff on the front end, but at least I can find, in a more safe fashion, web application flaws that way.
Great. Philip brought up, he said, you mentioned you're looking for texture variants in devices. A recommendation I typically see is you do your standard deployment package so they have the exact same configs throughout the org. With your texture insight, is it a better recommendation to not use standard configs and avoid creating network arrows that point to devices that look different? Sorry, this was a bit long-winded. No, I think that standardization is important, especially if you can maintain that baseline. Now, that's easier said than done for most organizations, but if you can standardize, you absolutely should, just from the perspective that it's easy for you to maintain it. And that's one of the reasons why in kind of textured organizations that have Linux, they have Windows, they have BSD, they have AIX servers all over the place, they tend to be easier to break into because they don't have the skills to effectively manage all of those different systems. Whereas if you standardize your build, you develop deep technical skills in the technology that you're working on, it makes it, one, a lot easier to patch, update, and maintain those servers. And number two, it makes them more secure because of it.
Well said, well said. You want to take one more question, then we turn it over to Keith? Is that okay?
Hold on, I've got a bunch of funny questions.
Well, before we, yeah, okay, so one of the most common questions is, hey, is this being recorded? The answer is yes. So you can listen to it. It'll be in your SANS portal account. So you've got access to it. There have been some other questions about the links and such. We're recording not only the audio, but the actual slide itself, the slide changes. So we've got that going for us. And one other thing I want to mention before John brings up the last question. I think I speak for many of us on this call, maybe all of us. I am so thankful that John Strand is doing well. I got an email from him Tuesday morning saying, I'm in the hospital, it's a heart issue. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, I freaked out. This is my buddy. This is my brother. And I sent an email back to him saying, what? WHA, question mark, call me now. And he called me now. And, we talked through it and such. We were thinking of canceling this webcast and went kind of back and forth on it. John really, really wanted to do it. I was against it, honestly. I'm telling you, Wednesday and even kind of Thursday morning, I'm thinking maybe we shouldn't do it. But John was really into it, wanted to do it, since we got great stuff to share for people. So, Mr. Strand, I bow and thank you so much. I am so glad that you are well. Stay well, please. And if there's anything any of us on this webcast can do, me or all these wonderful friends that we have joining us, you let us know. We want to keep you well. Okay?
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, I think that's it. Let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for attending, and be on the lookout for the next one, which, trust me, is just right around the corner. Thanks again, and I hope to see all of you guys at Hackfest. Thank you so much.
Yay. Keith, you want to close it out?
Sure thing. Thank you so much, John and Ed, for that amazing presentation and for bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, you can visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.